Good evening. This is the man in the corner seat. Tonight I will be reading a further ghost story from the collection Railway Ghosts by J.A.Brooks. Irish Jack. I was a long time looking at that remote, lonely churchyard, but at last I found it. Lichen made the inscription difficult to decipher, but the upper letters were clear enough. John Gibbon, known as Irish Jack, navigator and musician, found dead in a snowstorm at Floridan, January 3rd, 1844. After this, the letters were harder to read, being more weathered and screened by vegetation, but eventually the remainder of the words were revealed. This stone was raised from subscriptions offered by his workmates. The memory of the just is blessed, but the name of the wicked shall rot. Proverbs 10. This was the first clue in my quest to solve a mystery that had become very personal to me. I had seen a ghost, not once, but on many occasions, and had become strangely fond of him. Though I was not to know then of the frightful end to the haunting which I shall relate, at least I now felt sure that I knew the identity of the spectre. My haunting had begun on a January night, very many years ago now. In fact, so long ago that only steam locomotives used the main line, and those that ran in the liveries of the pre-nationalized companies. I worked a lonely signal box in South Norfolk on the Great Eastern Line between Norwich and Ipswich, and at that night I was on a late shift. It was a walk of some 3 miles from my cottage to the box, a fair way of it along the track. It was a wild night, the wind buffeting at my face, bearing half-hearted flurries of snow which hinted at heavier falls later to come. I was carrying an oil lantern, which for a time gave out a meagre, flickering light, until a particularly boisterous squall blew out the flame. This did not trouble me unduly, as I knew my path well, and once by the tracks could hardly lose my way. When I first heard the sound, I thought it was a trick of the wind in the branches and telegraph wires, perhaps. But I soon realized that I was not mistaken, and I was truly hearing the sound of bagpipes. Their music is always evocative of wild, lonely places, and there is a sadness in it which seems to come from the depths of someone's soul. I knew distinctly that the lament which was being played came from no earthly source, but I was intrigued rather than frightened. The sorrowful sound came to an end after a minute or so, and then I distinctly heard the wheezing noise that pipes make when the air is expelled at the finish of a piece. Several times during the course of that winter, a particularly hard, long one, I thought I caught further snatches of the lament, but they were fainter than on the first occasion, and I could never be certain that I was not deluding myself. However, the events of the following winter completely convinced me of the existence of the ghost and provided me with a few clues as to his identity. It was a brilliant moonlit night, again in midwinter, when I had my first visual encounter with Irish Jack. I clearly heard the sound of the pipes just after the up mail had passed by. This time I was on the steps of the box, having just taken the coal scuttle down for replenishment, when I heard the unearthly music. I glanced down the track, and with a stone's throw could see a figure, which I knew must be the phantom piper. The moonlight gave his outline a faintly luminous quality, and also removed all vestige of colour from the figure, though I suspected that there was little there anyway. However, it did allow me to take in the details of his dress and appearance. The strongest impression that I gained of him was his aura of sadness, which was emphasized by the music he played. For some curious reason, I was unable to see the expression on his features, but I knew from his stance that it would be sorrowful. I could see that there was something unusual about the way he played the pipes. Rather than blow into the bag in the style of the Scots, he used the bellows worked by the movement of an elbow against his side to inflate them. I subsequently learned that this is the way that the Irish play their bagpipes. His dress was shabby and utterly unlike anything I had come across before. Stained, baggy trousers made of a canvas-like material, a nondescript waistcoat which showed a multitude of seams. Later research revealed that the navvies of yesteryear were particularly fond of moleskin waistcoats, and a length of homespun cloth carelessly thrown about his shoulders. A small black and white dog sat at his feet. As he played, I knew that the music was for me. The tune was different to the one that I had heard first, but was just as plaintive. Quietly I put down the scuttle and descended the steps. As I moved toward the figure, the music he played faded, and the outline of the apparition vanished. I was left cursing myself for my impetuosity of my nature. A particular failing in me is my curiosity. I own to being both a gossip and a busybody, and yet for all that I wanted to discover the identity of the spectre. I was reluctant to tell anyone of my encounters with him. Thus I began to frequent public libraries, rummaging through old newspapers to find accounts of the building of the railway. There were no clues there on who the ghost could be. A strange flash of inspiration led me to explore a succession of country churchyards close to the railway, and it was in the third of these that I discovered Irish Jack. This discovery fueled my curiosity even further. The enigmatic epitaph seemed to hint at further mystery. My thoughts were so much of Irish Jack that I allowed my romance of 10 years standing to flounder, and my girl left me to marry the porter at Fauncett. A country signalman has an abundance of spare moments to brood over the events of his life. Most of those thoughts were directed towards the mystery of Irish Jack, and I spent many night times hours at the window of my cabin, willing him to reappear. But it is a known fact about apparitions that those attempting to seek them out will inevitably be disappointed. So it was with me now. Even on the most likely of nights, nothing appeared. Weeks, months, a year passed without incident. Although my interest in Jack was still keen, he began to be less often in the forefront of my thoughts. Perhaps this device was intended to make his reappearance more welcome. Certainly his spectacular manner was startling enough. The supernatural tableau was unfolded to me on the most inauspicious winter's night. A locomotive failure on my section had made life difficult early in the shift, with all the traffic using the down line. The trouble was sorted out shortly before midnight, and as I put the fresh water in my kettle, I looked forward to an hour or so of relaxation before the ringing of the telegraph bell would again demand my attention. It seemed no time at all before I dozed off, comfortably settled in the armchair close to the stove. Then, for no obvious reason, I felt fully awake. I glanced at the clock. 20 minutes were all that had elapsed, yet subtle changes had occurred to my environment. The light bulb which illuminated my area of the cabin was extinguished, and the one at the far end was giving out only a pathetic gleam. In sympathy with this, the fire in the stove had burned low. Before my lapse into sleep, its open door had given light from a cheerful blaze. But It was the scene that was revealed beyond the windows of the signal box which brought me fully to my senses and set my heart beating powerfully. An unnatural bluish light gleamed through the glass, serving to show that the countryside had undergone an amazing change. Much of the cutting away to my right had disappeared. Instead, the hillside was being scarred by the activities of 100 or so men who were working there. Some were emptying hods of earth into large wheelbarrows which were hitched to ropes to be pulled up the steep sides of this cutting in the making. The men between the shafts of the wheelbarrows had to fight hard to keep the barrows on the narrow plankways as they were hauled to the top. As I watched, one unfortunate fellow lost control of his overfilled barrow, which left the planks and emptied its load over its sprawling body. After a moment he pushed himself free of the mud spoil, shouting to his mates to show that he had survived the accident. Then I noticed a familiar figure sitting close to my viewpoint, which seemed to have escaped the traits of time. It was Irish Jack, his faithful terrier at his feet, who watched the activity going on around him in a detached way, an alien figure among those toiling so hard. The man at the head of the cutting, from his dress I guessed him to be the contractor, or his overseer, shouted and waved his arms. Immediately work halted, and the navvies ran away from their excavations. Seemingly within seconds, I saw puffs of smoke, and then a great bank of earth collapsed as the dynamite achieved its purpose. It would have been unlucky for a man to stumble in his flight, for to do so would mean being engulfed by a ton or more of earth, which would take an hour to shift. The movements of the workers now tended to suggest that this was the end of their toil for the day. Indeed, the strange light was by low degrees turning from blue to ever deeper shades of purple. Primitive huts lined the working, thatched with sacks, bracken and straw. To these the workmen retired, reappearing minutes later with steaming billy cans to eat their dinners by the fires which burned outside the openings, serving as doors. Now it was that Irish Jack got to his feet and painfully dragged his gaunt body over to the glow of the fires. The navvies watched him suspiciously, their hard faces showing no hint of welcome. Tentatively, he took the chanter of his pipes in his hands and inflated the bag with the bellows. And again I heard the sound of the lament he had played when I first saw him. It was an evocative of the deep sadness as it had been before, a longing for the heather-covered vastness of his own land so remote from the landscape of Norfolk. The audience were now finishing their food, scrubbing at the bottoms of their billy cans with enormous hunks of bread to remove the last drops of greasy stew. One by one they rose to their feet, moved towards the lines of barrels placed by one of the huts, taking with them great quart tankards which they filled with ale. Effortlessly, each man drained 2 of these measures and then returned to the fireside. Up to this time, I had only been able to recognize general sounds, but now I realized that my senses were tuned to voices also. The piper was offered a can of food and paused in his playing to eat, greedily, throwing crusts and morsels to his dog. The largest, most brutal-looking of the navvies addressed him in a rich Yorkshire brogue. "How does it work on the Shropshire Union Fair? They say that he pays well those that are left alive." "Surely," answered Jack, "if you care not what he makes you pay for, scrag end and a quart of porter. You fare better with your man here." From my experience in wartime, I was able to identify the part of Ireland to which he was native. His voice belied his looks. It was rich and throaty and bore the accent of a north of Ireland, Antrim, or close to Belfast. The men seemed now to have accepted his presence, and ale was given him. The talk continued to discuss railway projects of the past with which I was unfamiliar. Some, said Jack, were tempted to work in France, where pay was better and the contractors generally less rapacious. Suddenly, out of the gloom, a new figure appeared. It was a young boy of maybe 9 or 10, who was employed to lead the haulage which transported the soil removed from the cutting. He approached timidly, and his hands held an object tightly wrapped in a soiled red handkerchief. He was asked roughly what business he had with the group. In answer, without speaking, he unwrapped an object from its covering. I could see, as it was brought to the light of the fire, that it was an article of rare beauty. Although encrusted with dirt, its shape showed through. It was a large medallion in the shape of a bird. Its body was a huge pearl, its wings were sparkling with small precious stones of every hue, and its golden talons held two larger stones, an emerald and a ruby. "How did you come by this, boy?" asked the Yorkshireman. The boy's voice was gentle, timid, broad Norfolk. "Sir, it was just a lying on the ground by a great old puddle up at the top." "It's a bare bauble, useless, worthless, but I could try to get you a penny or two if it's from a man I know, if you give it here." One or two of the other men exchanged wry winks and smiled at his offer. No, sir, I like it too well. I'll be off to see my da tomorrow. He'll be tickled to see this here." "Well, you take care now not to lose it. Take yourself off to your bed. It's a long walk you'll have come morning." The boy left the fireside and pushed through the sacking door of one of the huts. Irish Jack picked up his pipes again and resumed playing. A less melancholy air now, almost a jig, while the others chatted and obtained a different form of satisfaction from their own pipes, which gave off thick, pungent fumes, which come from the coarsest of plugged tobaccos. Whether from previous experience or from remarkable vividness of hallucination, I could clearly smell that aroma. One by one, the navvies left the warmth of the fire for their beds in their huts. Some just nodded at Jack as they retired. He had by this time finished his playing. Others threw him coins. He settled down for a night, pulling his rough cloak over his body. I knew how he must have been, even though the little dog was asleep in the curve of his body. After a while, and I am unable to tell how long it was precisely, for in this strange dreamlike episode time seemed to have been telescoped, the boy returned to the fire and threw sticks on it to revive its blaze. Carefully he unwrapped his beautiful treasure from its cloth and turned it in the firelight, watching its coloured stones sparkle as though they had an abundance of energy to release after being hidden for all those years. The boy had probably never had a toy in his life, or anything to truly call his own, and I felt the joy and wonder in him as he handled the priceless object. However, the boy's pleasure was to last for too short a moment. Although my entire will was directed at warning him of the danger that was approaching, I was unable to utter a sound, or indeed even appear to any of the actors in the savage tableau that was being unfolded before me. I saw two dark shapes emerge stealthily from the hut. They skirted the fire in order to come on the boy unseen from behind. It was the big Yorkshireman and his crony, a balding, weasel-faced villain who had disliked at sight when I had first set eyes on him earlier. The fat man clasped a hand over the boy's mouth. His body convulsed, and then I saw the knife in his hand of the murderer as he wrenched it from the body. His accomplice picked up the fallen medallion. They were so intent on their business that they had failed to notice that Jack, who had appeared a bundle on the ground some way distant from the fire, had awoken, and his hand over the muzzle of his dog had crept from the scene. The Yorkshireman next took the medallion, wrapping it again in his blood-stained cloth that the boy had used. He was about to pocket it in his voluminous waistcoat when he noticed the abandoned blanket of the piper. He pointed at it to his accomplice, for a moment looking concerned, but then shrugged and whispered, "So be it then. He may be the scapegoat. Go now to your rest, and set off the hue and cry in his direction when the boy is discovered. Then make yourself scarce. We'll meet as I said." This said, he made off into the darkness, while the rat-faced man silently disappeared into a hut. A short time later it seemed the camp awoke. A dishevelled, unsavoury woman emerged from the nearest hut, stretching and scratching herself. Even though it was still before dawn, she was not long in finding the body of the boy, who lay where he had died. Her screams woke the rest of the workforce, and I noticed Ratface was one of the first on the scene. It was he who pointed out the abandoned blanket of the piper and the direction that the supposed murderer had taken. The navvies grabbed picks and shovels from the working and set off in pursuit. though it was noticeable that Rat-Face kept to the rear of the throng. Irish Jack, however, must have had his suspicions at the time that events were being directed. As the hue and cry disappeared into the distance, he emerged from a hiding place and began to make his way past the huts in the opposite direction, towards the head of the excavation. It was his misfortune that the harridan who had first raised the alarm should emerge from her hut at this moment and come face to face with, as she thought, the murderer. Her screams were so powerful as they had been before, and arrested the navvies from their headlong pursuit. Jack had hoped to climb up the steep muddy slope of the digging unobserved, but now that his whereabouts were betrayed, he had no chance of doing this. Instead, he stood his ground, trying to soothe the hysterical woman, obviously with the intention of proving his innocence to the angry workers. However, he was given no chance of doing this. The mob descended on him, and with their improvised weapons, and in seconds he was on the ground. His hands, at first upraised to protect his head, soon fell limp and bloody as his assailants increased their frenzy. I saw a flash of white as the dog ran around the ankles of the mob, nipping and biting. It was dispatched by a swing of a shovel. As the terrible fury of the men became exhausted, it began to snow. Small flakes at first, but these rapidly grew in size until the whole scene was blotted out, and I was magically returned to my cabin and my expected view of opaque darkness. For days and weeks following, I pondered my vision. I came to the conclusion that there must be further events that would eventually be shown to me. Otherwise, how could the navvies have become enough reconciled to Irish Jack to subscribe to his grave? Of course, they would find that the medallion was not concealed on his person, but would the real murderers ever be brought before the law? I was convinced that my dream had revealed the truth to me, but felt that there must be some business left undone. Why else had the ghost appeared to me? This time the answer was not long in coming. Conditions of climate seemed to have served as a trigger again, this time for the final part of my supernatural sequence, or so I pray. The night was wet as I trudged the line-side path to the box. It was cold, and on my way the rain turned to sleet, and by the time I arrived at the box it had become snow. The last trains of the evening passed through. There was a long interval when I knew that no traffic was to approach that section, and so the bell would be quiet for a time. Again I settled to a gentle reverie in my armchair, and again I was transported to the landscape of the past. On this occasion my eyes were directed into the wood at the top of the cutting. I could distinguish little at first, but at last the murky light revealed a man crouched unnaturally on the ground. It was the Yorkshireman, and I soon saw the reason for his strange posture. A man-trap had him by both legs. As I watched, his body keeled over, and I saw his grimace of pain as the jaws of the trap tore his flesh. I knew by the depth of snow around him, and by the amount of blood that he had spilled, that he had been trapped for some time. His shoulders shook with the agony of his predicament, and by the pallor of his face I could see that his final moments were approaching. With a final effort, he raised himself on one arm and threw an object away from him. This accomplished, he fell back, his face pressed hard to the snow. I knew that the object was the medallion, and that I had seen a murderer suffering his last deserts. The cold would leave his body lifeless before the hour was out. My attendant spirit led my eyes to where the medallion fell. It was hidden between the convoluted roots of a venerable oak tree. I was allowed to dwell on the shape and aspect of the tree for a long moment, before I realized that the increasing snowfall was about to blot out the image and return me to my natural senses. Now I asked myself for what purpose I had been given these details. I dwelt on the problem for some days before exploring the wood, which remained on either side of the cutting. It took but an hour or so to discover the oak whose roots concealed the medallion. It was in a state of decline, but its contorted base was, as I remembered. With a trowel I carefully scraped at the accumulation of leaf mould between the contorted roots. I was rewarded at first, a cloth wrapped, and then by the brilliant sparkle of gemstones of a medallion. Extracting it, I felt the entrancement that it had held for the boy a century before. As I look at it now on the table in front of me, it retains its matchless beauty, and yet I begin to feel uneasy about the object. Its brilliance sometimes seems to be unworldly. Its contours are not rhythmic in the way of a craftsman would make them, but seem to jar on the mind as well as the eye. I believe that the talisman has a significance that I do not understand, and that there may be ill fortune in it. After all, it has brought about the death of 3 people that I know of. May I not be the 4th? This is my purpose in relating this strange story. I am a lonely man, and know few that will care much should I suffer an unnatural fate. But, finder, beware of the prospect of evil in the thing you will find wrapped in the stained cloth in my pocket. This is the man in the corner seat, saying thank you for listening, and good night, till the next time.